For those of you who are new to us or just visiting us this morning, here at Elmstead Baptist Church, we understand that the Bible is God's word given to us to tell us about him. And so we make a special priority of spending time looking at his word each Sunday. And his word, the Bible, is made up of 66 different books. And so what we do is we take a book, we work our way through it week by week. And the moment we're working through the book of Daniel, which takes place about 600 years before Jesus was born, and it focuses on a man called Daniel, who was a Jewish man in exile in the city of Babylon. As we see Daniel experiencing exile, he is pointing us to God and showing us what God is like. And from that, he's teaching us how we are to live in response to what God is like as those who are also in an exile. And today we're in Daniel chapter 6. So if I could ask you, please, to turn to that part of the Bible, Daniel chapter 6, which you will find on page 891. Page 891, if you're using one of the church Bibles, Daniel and chapter 6. Now, last week I quoted from Shakespeare. I'm going to go a bit more modern this week. I'm going to quote from another famous person in literature, Albus Dumbledore. I am a big fan of the Harry Potter books and films. I'm pleased that I've seemed to have passed that on to my children rather than my family walk. And in the fourth book, just after the return of the evil and powerful Voldemort, Albus Dumbledore looks at Harry and he says, "Harry, dark times lie ahead of us. And there will be a time where we must choose between what is easy and what is right." And that is certainly the case for Daniel in chapter 6, isn't it? Daniel is now in his mid-80s. He's a big boy, or certainly he's an old boy, and he's got big choices that have big consequences. And in fact, chapter 6 is based around a series of choices that Daniel has to make as a man of God who is living in exile. Big choices between what is easy and what is right, and the consequences that come from those. So let's read chapter 6. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 chief ministers over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the chief ministers and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. At this, the chief ministers and the satraps tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs, but they were unable to do so. They found no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, these men said, "We will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it has something to do with the law of his God." So these chief ministers and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever." The royal ministers, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree and put it in writing so that it cannot be altered in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. did you not publish a decree that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being, except to you, your majesty, would be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, the decree stands in accordance with the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be repealed. And then they said to the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. And when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. He was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until the sun set to save him. Then the men went as a group to King Darius and said to him, remember, your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no decree or edict that the king issues can be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. The king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of the dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he came near to the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? And Daniel answered, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty. And the king was overjoyed and gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted his God. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. And then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom, people must fear and reverence the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And so Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Well, please do keep that open in front of you, and hopefully you also handed a page of sermon notes that you can use to help you as we move through this together. So there is a new king in town. We were introduced to him at the end of chapter 5. He is Darius the Mede, and he has come and killed the kings of the Babylon Empire, and he's taken over their kingdom. Now, those of you who know your Bible well, especially those who know the book of Isaiah, might be thinking, well, hang on, who is this Darius the Mede? Isn't it supposed to be Cyrus the Persian that comes and does all this? And the answer to that is could be one of two things. It could be that Darius the Mede is Cyrus the Persian. It's just he has his Persian name Cyrus, and he has his Mede name Darius. Or it could be that Darius is the man that Cyrus has put in charge of Babylon to rule on his behalf, a bit like we saw with Nabonidus and Belshazzar last week. Either way, Darius is in charge of Babylon. He's the new man in town, and he decides he needs to sort out the civil service. He needs to make sure things run properly around here, that everyone does as they're told, and that they don't lose out on any taxes. Learning about taxes this morning, weren't we? Doesn't miss out on any taxes. Some things never change. So he puts these regional governors in place. He calls them satraps. and then he puts 3 ministers in place to manage them on his behalf. And one of those ministers is Daniel. And Daniel is the best of the bunch. Verse 3, it says, "Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the chief ministers and the satraps by his exceptional qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom." You see, Daniel has made a choice. He's in his 80s. He could have decided that it would be time to spend a nice retirement at home. He could have decided he'd had enough. This is just another godless king running another godless country where no one is interested in or humbles themselves before God. Why would I want to do anything that helps this society do well? But Daniel makes the choice to serve the city that God has placed in it. And actually, in doing that, Daniel has made the choice to obey God. You see, God had written to the exiles in Babylon through his prophet Jeremiah. You can read it in Jeremiah 29, and he says there in verse 7 that the exiles are to seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. And Daniel says, that is what God has told me to do, and so that is what I'm going to do. Now, remember that we have seen that as people who follow Christ in this world, people who live on this side of the return of Christ, we are also described as being in exile. And one of the temptations of living in exile will be the temptation to hide away, to batten down the hatches, to pull up the shutters, to withdraw from all those non-Christians and this terrible culture that God has placed us in, to hide away until Christ returns and sorts all this mess out, except maybe for a weekly trip to Aldi. But you know, that is the wrong choice to make. Now, we need to choose to work hard to seek the prosperity of the place where God has placed us into exile. Now, Daniel never chose to simply blend in or go with the flow or to be completely assimilated into the Babylonian culture. We're about to see that, but he chose to remain distinct, but he also chose to remain engaged. Daniel chooses to serve the city. And he does that, verse 4, he does that in how he does that, he is trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. He shows up when he says he'll show up. He does what he's supposed to do. He does it to the best of his ability. He puts himself out to help others. He's reliable and honest and kind and generous and dependable. He reflects the character of the God he's serving. And that's how we're to live as we serve. Not doing the least amount that we can get away with, not saying we'll do something but then not following it through. You know, this living in exile, it's not just about having a tract in your pocket ready to hand out or a Bible tucked under your arm or saying in the office on a Monday, oh yes, I went to church yesterday. None of that is any good unless we are seen as trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Alistair Begg says in the book I've been recommending to you, it is a significant thing to be a man of purity in a dirty world, or to be a woman of integrity in a shady world. It is a significant thing. But there are consequences to choosing to be like that. There are positive consequences. The king notices Daniel's integrity and skill. He wants to promote him, but all that does is leads to the jealousy of his co-workers. Now, you think you'd love to work for a man like Daniel, wouldn't you? Wouldn't you want him as your boss? Trustworthy, honorable, reliable. Oh, no. Because he might expect you to be all of those things as well. You see, they're jealous. And he's awkward. And they want to take him down. Isn't it the same as with Jesus? Wouldn't you think that when you look at Jesus, when you see Jesus in the Gospels, that a man of such integrity, of such kindness, who is so trustworthy and pure, don't you think people would want to be led by him? that what happened? Is that how most people feel about Jesus today? No, it isn't what we see here in Daniel in chapter 6, verse 4. Isn't that what John says in his gospel in chapter 3, verse 19, when he says, this is the verdict, light has come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light. So they want to put the light out. They want to get away from the light. The problem is, though, with Daniel, they can't find anything wrong with him. One commentator says that one of the big miracles of Daniel 6 is that here is a politician who no one can find any fault with. And they realize, verse 5, that if they're going to get Daniel, they're going to have to do something. They're going to have to get him on something that is to do with his God. So they come up with what my children's storybook Bible describes as a naughty plan. Because they went off and had a naughty plan. I think that sums it up, doesn't it? They go to the king. They pay him a bit of flattery. They make sure they say Your Majesty a lot. And they say that for the next month, make it so that no one is allowed to pray to anyone, to any god or any human being, except for you, Your Majesty. And just to make sure this is watertight, they're very good civil servants, you see. They make sure they include the Persian law clause. By the way, you think I'm having pops at civil servants? I used to be one. It's okay. But they're very good civil servants. They make sure they tie it up nicely, that they get the Persian law clause included. That once something has been put into writing, cannot be changed or withdrawn. And Darius thinks, yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, people should come and ask me for things, shouldn't they? Yes, it's a good idea. I like the fact that people will be dependent on me. And actually, it's a very good thing that my newly conquered subjects see me as the one that's going to look after them and the one that's going to supply their needs. This is a very good idea. I think I'm going to sign that form now. And you see, this is part of living in exile, isn't it? That even sympathetic leaders make stupid, short-sighted choices that impact those people of society who want to be good members of society, but also want to be faithful followers of God. You see, even though there is a new king in town, there are the same old problems. It's the problem that's been there since Adam and Eve. It's the problem that will continue to be there no matter who is in charge. It is the problem of human pride that sets itself up in opposition to God's rule, with God's people caught in the middle. So we shouldn't ever put our hope in some new political leader. Things won't get better for the people of God under a new king or a new prime minister or a different political party or the result of this new great cultural movement or even from the COP26 meeting taking place this month. No. Now we need to listen to the psalmist when he says, do not put your trust in princes, in human beings who cannot save, but blessed are those whose hope is in the Lord their God. He remains faithful forever. But by putting this new law in place, the king has inadvertently given Daniel another choice. And it's a choice of which king is he going to obey? Well, for Daniel, there is no choice. Verse 10, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day, he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. There are all sorts of reasons that Daniel could have given not to pray. It's only a month. I've prayed to God every month for 85 years. There's lots of prayers that have gone up. I can take a month off. It's not like I'm never going to pray to him again. And we don't want to be legalistic about prayer, do we? I mean, it doesn't really matter how I pray or when I pray or how often I pray. I'll just do it in my own head and hope nobody notices. Or this could be good for me. I was in sort of a rut. You get into a routine. It's just you're doing it out of habit. Well, this is going to help me break the habit, make me realize how much I enjoy prayer. Or I'm 85. I'm too old for this stuff. Let someone else have the fight. I just want to see my time out quietly without a fuss. Just thinking about how old Daniel is here, it is worth noting, isn't it, that old age is no guard against trials and temptations. And it is no excuse for hiding away from the fight or making unfaithful choices and behaviors. But it is also worth pausing for a moment and asking ourselves, would we see prayer as this vital? Would we see prayer as so vital that we could not go a day without it, let alone a month? I mean, I had to ask myself this week, would a 30-day ban on prayer make any meaningful difference to my life? And just think about the choice you make when you have the opportunity to attend a prayer meeting or a fellowship group or a prayer group. You know, the sad truth is that for a lot of Christians, it takes far less than a state ban to stop them from praying. And you know, the choice to pray is one that we have to make daily. I always remember one church leader, some of you will know him, a guy called Rico Tice. He says that if he is chosen to go to bed after 10:30 at night, he's already made the choice not to pray the next morning. If he chooses to go to bed after 10:30 at night, he's already chosen not to pray the next morning because he knows he won't wake up in time. And it's not just that Daniel chose not to pray to Darius. That is not enough. That's the easy bit, right? I can not go and ask Darius for anything for a month. That'll be fine. But no. It's easy to make that choice. The difficult choice is to continue to pray to God. And that is the real choice at the center of this story. Does Daniel obey King Darius and keep his position and keep his job and keep his wage and keep his life? Or does he obey a higher king? Does he remain faithful to God, but face the very likely possibility of his death? Daniel respects the king, but he also knows that there is a higher king who supersedes every other king and must be obeyed over every other king, even if that costs him his life. And you know, part of what gives Daniel the ability to make this choice, part of what gives him this kind of strength and resolve, is that he had already made this choice a very long time ago. Don't miss that little comment there at the end of verse 10. 3 times a day, Daniel went and prayed. He got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to God, just as he had done before. Have you ever heard that phrase, old habits die hard? We normally mean that negatively, right? This is a good habit that was dying hard for Daniel. You know, it's not like the satraps had to do a lot of staking out, is it? It's not as if they had to go and wait in a car for, or whatever the Babylonian chariot. He ended up go wait in a chariot for like 2 days, staking Daniel out. Is he going to pray? Is he going to pray? No, they just got together and said, well, hang on, lads, we'll give it a few hours and then we'll pop along. And if it's shut, I mean, could any one of us be arrested because of the consistency and commitment to our prayer life like Daniel was? Would they know how to catch you out easily? Or if we just go to Elmstead Baptist Church on the first Sunday evening of the month at 6:30 p.m, we'll get the lot of them. Or if we pop round to his house at 7 o'clock in the morning, we'll find him. He'll be there, Bible open, praying. And for those of us that are a bit younger than Daniel is here, get into these habits now. Not just because they're going to carry you on when you get older, but because you've already made that choice before the pressure of the conflict arises and you're under pressure to compromise. Make the decision before then. Because these choices the choice between what is right and what is easy, it will come to us. You know, there is legislation being drafted right now regarding a ban on conversion therapy. And I can't help but see some similarities between the satraps in Daniel 6 and those calling on a ban on praying to be included as part of this legislation. And many Christians are asking, you get ministers that are saying, oh, well, what are we going to do if that happens? And I'm telling you, I'm making the choice now. I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray because God tells me to pray. How? Where? When? With whom? That needs some wisdom. But it should never be that I'm told not to pray, so I'm not going to pray. But we don't just face the choice about being faithful in prayer. Every day we face choices. Are we going to be faithful or not? In every area of our life, in every relationship, in every interaction, in every responsibility, you are faced daily with the choice, am I going to be faithful to God or not? And so the question you need to ask yourself right now is, who is going to have the highest authority in my life? What is the ultimate authority in my life going to be? Who is going to win out in that moment when the pressure is on? You? Are you the authority? Are your friends? Are your family? Are the school? Is your company? Is the government? Or is it God? Well, Daniel has made the choice about which king he's going to obey. But it has consequences. The trap has been set by the satraps. And now the trap is sprung. Off they go to the king. And they make sure they confirm with the king first the legalities of the situation. You know, king, remember the law clause? And the king says, yes, 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 yes. And then they tell him about Daniel. And even though Darius tries everything he possibly can to help Daniel, Daniel's time is up. And so verse 16, the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel, and they threw him into the lion's den. And the king said to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. And that is the last choice that Daniel faces. Will he trust in God? As Darius says here, may your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. Is he going to trust the king he has chosen to obey, to be the king who will rescue him? And it is interesting, isn't it, to note the amount of attention that Darius gets here. You might expect to hear all about Daniel. What is the pit like? How many lions were in the pit? What did the lions do? You know, did they growl a bit and then calm down? Or, you know, how did that work? Was the angel waiting for him? What was Daniel doing and thinking? Wouldn't you like to know all those things? And yet we're told about Darius, about how Darius spends the night, not how Daniel spends the night. So verse 18, the king returns to his palace. He spends the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. He's a man full of concern, and he's a man full of worry, and he's a man that's up all night, and he's a man that can do absolutely nothing. All of his power, and yet he's powerless to save Daniel from death. Makes every effort to try and save Daniel from, first of all, even going into the den. But then when he's in the den, he stays up all night, no food, no fun, no sleep. It's as how somehow if he does that, Daniel might actually be all right. But it does nothing. Psalm 147 again, isn't it? Do not put your trust in princes, in human beings who cannot save. And Daniel's choice is a choice we all face, because one day we will all face death. I'm trusting that's not a shocking moment for any of you here this morning. And there are all sorts of people, and there are all sorts of things that might be genuinely concerned for you, and might be genuinely working hard to help you, but that are ultimately powerless to save you. But there is a king who we can trust, who does have power over death. The next morning, Darius rushes to the entrance of the den, and he calls out to Daniel, has God been able to rescue you? I love that. Has God been able to rescue you? Able? Do you know who my God is? Of course he's able. Verse 21, may the king live forever. My God sent his angels, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done anything wrong before you, your majesty. And so the king is overjoyed, and he gives orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And listen here. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. Not even a scratch. Saved, and saved completely. How? There at the end of verse 23. Because Daniel had made the choice to trust in his God. Does this scene remind you of anything else? Do the satraps remind you of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teachers of the law who go to Pilate and say, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die? You know, Daniel is given the sentence of death, even though he is blameless. Jesus is put to death, even though he is blameless. And look at it, Daniel is lowered into the lion's den. What is that? That is effectively a tomb, isn't it? It's a place of death that he isn't coming out of. And the entrance to that tomb, verse 17, it's covered with a stone, and it's sealed with the king's own rings so that his situation might not be changed. And well, does that ring any bells? Isn't Daniel's burial pointing us towards Jesus's, who is placed in a tomb, and the stone is rolled over the entrance, and Pilate's ring is used to seal the tomb so that his situation might not be changed. And that, all of that, is before you get to the angels. Daniel is saved from death because he trusted in God. Jesus is risen from death because he trusted in God. 1 Peter 2. He committed no sin. No deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he trusted himself to him who judges justly. And as Daniel emerges alive from the tomb, so Jesus gloriously walks out of his tomb. In fact, Jesus is even greater than Daniel, because Daniel is placed in the tomb and doesn't die. Jesus is placed in the tomb dead and is resurrected never to die again. And isn't this what Jesus promised? He said that I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And his empty tomb is the glorious, unequivocal proof that he is exactly what he claimed to be. He is the resurrection and the life, and he can do exactly what he claimed to do, that he who believes in him will not die, will live even though they die. And so the question you need to ask yourself this morning is, do you believe that? Are you going to trust him in that? If we choose to trust this king, if we choose to trust Jesus, the blameless king, the king who died and then rose again, then we too will be found blameless, and we too will be rescued from death, and we too, like Daniel, will be lifted from our tomb. Now, I know that there are Christians all over the world who trust in Christ and yet still face death. Some from illness, some from tragedy. Some are being mauled to death now because of the persecution of fellow citizens and the choice that those people have made to trust in God and to trust in Jesus. Now, God rescued Daniel, and he may choose to provide some temporary rescue to others. And there may be some that he doesn't. There may be some that he leaves in the lion's den to be mauled. But there is a rescue that God offers to everyone that chooses to trust in him, a final and a full rescue of eternal life, whether they go into the tomb or not. And so we have a choice to trust in this King who rescues. Because there is a choice and there is a consequence whichever way you choose. For those who trust like Daniel did, there is salvation. But for those who don't, there is the brutal reality of judgment. Verse 24. At the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And before they reached the floor of the den, the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Now, that's the tough bit of Daniel 6, isn't it? I mean, you can probably live with the satraps being thrown into the pit, right? They were sort of asking for it. They've not been very nice. It was a very naughty plan. But their wives and their children, it's tough and it's brutal. But please don't let that distract you from the main point there. Because what happens here? Daniel is thrown to the lions, but he's saved because he's trusting in God. And so God comes to rescue him. The satrap and the families are thrown to the same lions, but they are overpowered and crushed because there is no one to rescue them. That's the choice you make. If you make that choice not to trust in God, there will be no one to save you as you approach your death. And you will be overpowered and crushed before you even hit the floor. In a moment, we're going to sing. You alone can rescue. You alone can save. You alone can lift us from the grave. You came out to find us, led us out of death. To you alone belongs the highest praise. What choice will you make? And to you alone belongs the highest praise. That is true of Darius. His response there, he issues a decree. Verse 26, he is the living God, and he endures forever, and his kingdom will not be destroyed, and his dominion will never end. He rescues and he saves. My friends, dark and difficult times lie ahead, and we will all face the choice between what is easy and what is right. And Daniel tells you to keep choosing to be obedient and to keep trusting in the God who saves and in his final deliverance. Because that is what Daniel is here in the Bible to do. Remember, it is not about daring to be Daniel. It's not about trying to be like Daniel. Daniel isn't saved by the strength of his faith. He is saved by the strength of the God that he has faith in. Verse 26, the living God who endures forever, whose kingdom will not be destroyed, whose dominion will never end, the God who rescues and saves his people. And so keep standing firm, keep trusting in him. Let's pray.